So, here we're getting into some real basic stuff, right? Why do we even bother to tell the good from the bad when it comes to art? Why do some artists become legends, while others make a splash for a bit and then fade into obscurity? When it comes to music, I've got to say, some of that pop music was a big deal when it first came out. Everyone was singing and loving it. So, you're into pop songs, right? You probably collected a bunch of records over time, but do you still go back and listen to them? Nah, you probably chucked them when you moved. Me, I've got hundreds of classical music records, and I wouldn't toss a single one. They're gonna be with me for life. Some of them might not sound all that pretty, but they've got this deep, rich vibe that you can't fully appreciate in just one lifetime. And hey, I'm not trying to diss pop music here. It's like a star, but a shooting star, you know? It streaks across the sky and then it's gone. But those timeless musical masterpieces? They're like stars, they're here to stay. They've touched and inspired people for generations because they've got this deep, wide-ranging vibe. The depth and breadth of this vibe can be summed up in one thing. Despite all the changes over the years, those classic musical works from centuries ago are still something we're eager to dive into today. What does that tell you about their vibe? It just goes to show that this concept of inner vision is crucial. It's the ultimate point to consider when we talk about the nature and existence of artistic works. So, let's break down the relationship between external vision and internal vision. When an artist creates something, they're always putting forward an external vision. It's just part of the whole creative process. But here's the thing, presenting the external vision isn't the end goal of making a piece of art, it's just a way of doing it. The real deal is the internal vision that shapes the final result. Every piece of art is made, it's an object, so it's been crafted. Making art is all about giving this object a vision, giving it a perspective. This external vision starts to take shape during the creative process. But that's just the process. The real aim is to bring out the internal vision. And if this internal vision is deep and wide enough, what do we call it? It's something that can't be fully expressed in words but has endless meaning. Because of this endless meaning, we need to figure out what this internal vision really is. We can't quite put our finger on it, but we know it's there. How do we know it's there? It's not because we've seen it. What we've seen is the external vision. Instead, we're pulled into it by the external vision, we're caught up in it. Once we enter into it, what do we call it? When we enter the inner visual domain, it is no longer the object that we are observing, the object we observe is the outer visual domain. Since we observe the outer visual domain, we are drawn into the inner visual domain. And this inner visual domain is not just a collection of ideas, but rather a lived experience, a sensory experience. It is still sensual, still imagistic. But importantly, it is still a vision, and the entire mystery lies here. This sensory image that exists as the inner visual domain is not as concretely identifiable as the objects in the outer visual domain. So this kind of image, it is not directly perceptible, and yet it is still an image. So, here's the deal, when we get sucked into the inner vibe of a piece of art, something pretty cool happens. It's like this whole surreal world pops up, not in a deep, philosophical way or a religious kind of vibe, but it's all about the imagery. The artwork's inner vision is just sitting there, waiting for us to jump in. Once we're in there, we're back to thinking about how art and truth are connected, unless the truth we're talking about is always about logic, math, or science. But what's truth, really? It's like a whole new way of looking at the world, thanks to the help of the artwork. It's like, we could totally ask Sartre about it, he's got some good thoughts on the matter. In this book I wrote about art philosophy, I threw in a big chunk of Sartre's words from page 103. I started off talking about how the artwork is made, and it all leads to this idea of the inner vision of the work, which is basically the thing that's been created in the artwork. So, what's being created in the work? It's not just the outside look of the artwork that we see, it's something that's been made beyond that outside look, and we call it the inner vision. In the fourth paragraph on page 103, I said, the flashy, eye-catching form of the artwork often hides the fact that something's been created in there. We tend to just see those beautiful forms as the whole deal, forgetting about the real creation that's going on. Sure, let's break down this passage in a more casual way. So, we're diving into a bit of Sartre's thoughts here. You know, the French dude who's all about existentialism and wrote that famous book, Being and Nothingness. He's also a writer, and in his book, The Psychology of Imagination, he straight up says that artworks are kind of unreal. But hold up, is artwork really unreal? I mean, it's a physical thing you can touch, and it's got an image you can see, right? It's not like we're talking about some abstract concept here, we're talking about actual objects that satisfy our sense of beauty. So, why does Sartre say they're unreal? Well, according to him, the real deal is in the brushstrokes, the texture of the canvas, and the colors. That's where the true reality lies. When you look at a painting, you're not really experiencing beauty through your eyes, it's something beyond just what you see. Here's the kicker, the painter isn't just copying images from their mind onto the canvas. They're creating a physical imitation of those images. And when people see this imitation, they get what the original image is all about. But even though the painting represents something, it's still just an image and can't become real. Every stroke on the canvas isn't about creating a unified reality, it's about blending real colors to bring out an unreal image. So, when we look at a painting, we should see it as an object that's not entirely real, but it's also not just a figment of our imagination. It's like a bridge between the real and the unreal, and that's what makes it so fascinating. What tricks us is how the real-looking colors in this painting give us such a genuine sensory thrill. Take Monet's Water Lilies, have you seen it? It's amazing, right? Like, really amazing. Monet, the boss of Impressionism. His color game is out of this world. You don't see those kinds of colors in nature, do you? They're so captivating, aren't they? Just absolutely stunning. But Sartre's like, hold up, don't get fooled. The joy of aesthetics is totally legit, for real. When we're soaking in the beauty of Monet's water lilies, that aesthetic joy is super real, no doubt. But here's the thing, the point of aesthetics isn't just to get pleasure from the real colors themselves. It's more about how we understand non-real stuff. The thing it's all about is way beyond this actual painting, you feel me? It's not that hard to get this, right? I've been to the Louvre twice, you know. They've got a ton of famous paintings there. I mean, they're like the big shots in the history of European painting, right? But when I checked them out, there weren't that many that really blew me away. What's up with that? I guess painting has been on a long journey, aiming for that super realistic and delicate vibe. Who does that rendering of the fabric remind you of, anyway? There's this super famous painting, The Coronation of Napoleon, that scene. Have you seen it? When you first lay eyes on it, it's just crazy realistic. You can almost feel the velvety texture, can't you? Especially the long dress worn by the Queen. And then there's the carpet, right? Man, you can't help but give props to Western painting at this stage, the way they can capture external scenes on the canvas. Just think about it, Chinese painting doesn't quite hit that level. That lifelike sensation. What does it bring to your vision? A tactile sensation. You haven't even touched it, but it feels like you have. The way this feeling transforms, the way it connects, it's just mind-blowing to think about. Chinese painting always feels a bit off, right? It's like, kinda rough around the edges. They should really take a leaf out of Western painting's book, learn their brushwork, techniques, use of color, and perspective. If we only judge a painting's value based on these criteria, many would definitely end up in the Louvre. But you know what? These paintings are super skilled in technique, but they're missing that poetic vibe, aren't they? Like, totally lacking in poetry. You can check them out, appreciate the technique, and then move on. I think Western painting really hit its stride with the Impressionist movement, gaining its own unique value that can't be replaced by other art forms. It's all about expressing deep emotions on the canvas. So, Hegel was onto something when he said that the essence of painting isn't so much like sculpture, but more like what? Closer to music. Hegel classified the 5 major art forms in the following order. Architecture is the most obscure and most abstract, symbolic art, then comes romantic art, followed by sculpture, painting, and music, and finally poetry, where the material elements are almost completely stripped away. There are still material elements like the vibration of the instruments and the vocal cords in music. But in poetry, all material elements have been removed. This is what we call literature or poem. This ordering has its own logic. Hegel then said that the position of painting is closer to music, rather than closer to sculpture. If we were to view painting merely as a representation of imagery, then it would belong to the same category as sculpture. But in reality, painting is an expression of inner sentiments. It presents the rich and nuanced emotions of the human psyche on the canvas. I think Hegel was absolutely right about this. However, Western painting had to go through a long journey before it reached this core principle of painting. What is the aesthetic principle of painting then? It is to use the depiction of external objects, scenes or figures to express the artist's inner, poetic emotions. So every brushstroke on the canvas should be imbued with poetic sensibility. This is something that Chinese painting recognized and embodied much earlier. So, you know when Wang Wei was talking about being both a poet and a painter? Later on, people started saying that about him, right? They said his poetry has painting in it, and his painting has poetry in it. That's the idea. For a long time, Westerners didn't really have that poetic vibe in their paintings. I'm talking about Western painting here. When the Romantic stage came along, the poetic meaning in painting started to show up, but it was still stuck on being super realistic. It just couldn't let go of that need for realism. So, the poetic meaning was kind of held back. Now, when it comes to Impressionism, what's the deal? You all know about the history of Impressionist painting, right? At first, when these folks got into Impressionism, the whole European art world couldn't handle it. When they showed their works, people would make fun of them, saying stuff like, "You're showing us something half done, it's not even finished, and you're showing it to us." That's how Impressionism got started. You see, with Western oil painting, you usually have to apply several layers of paint, layer by layer, but with Impressionist works, it looks like they're only half done, and they're showing them to us. What's up with that? They're not trying to be super realistic in their descriptions of things anymore. Instead, they're going for the impression of light and shadow in a moment, and that impression expresses what we feel from life. They're capturing that moment, right? So, they're not sticking to what? They're not just following those external scenes anymore. Instead, they're using those external scenes to express the inner feelings of life, and that's how Impressionism got started. The paintings of Impressionism are full of poetry, no longer stuck on being super realistic, and that's how the poetic meaning gets to shine through. So, this bit by Sartre really comes from the heart. He's not just talking about art theory in general. He's actually building on what Impressionism has already brought to the table. Sartre is using Impressionism as a springboard. He's not just throwing around the word impressionism, you know. He's saying, when we look at a painting, what are we really seeing? The realistic colors that give us a genuine sensory pleasure actually trick us. The artist doesn't want to give us those things. They want to give us a different world, a world we can step into. So, when the painter finishes a painting, what's the finishing touch? It's the inner vision. And then what's expected? The viewer's own imagination kicks in. And finally, the aesthetic image shows up. That's the real deal in the painting. Check out this line: whenever the viewer uses their imagination, the painting is actually receiving the arrival of a different image. What's he telling us? Where does the completion of a work ultimately lie? It's all about the viewer accepting it. The work has been finished and put out there. It's a possibility, but it's a very objective possibility because it's been created with an inner vision. If the work doesn't have a true inner vision, no matter how much the viewer imagines, it's all pointless. You can only appreciate the sensory pleasure it gives you, get a bit of satisfaction from the aesthetic pleasure. But it does not free your mind. If the work objectively guides you into an inner vision, then your imagination can come into play. The viewer's own imagination, coming from their own life experiences and emotions. This emotional imagination lets you step into this inner vision, and then an aesthetic image is formed from this inner vision. So, what is this aesthetic image coming from? It's coming from the viewer. It's not something that already exists in the work. In this work, the only thing that already exists is the inner vision, waiting to be accepted. Through this acceptance, the aesthetic image is formed. The formation of the aesthetic image ultimately makes the artwork what? The emergence of truth. Truth isn't just sitting there in that artwork, waiting for us to grasp it. The truth of art is the result of the interaction between the art receiver and the artwork. So, a true work of art should be put out there. It's waiting for what? The receiver. Once the receiver connects with the work, produces an aesthetic image, the world of truth arrives. Truth arrives. Why do we say truth has arrived? We'll talk about that in the next class. That's it for today.